Thank you again for being here as we continue our journey with the discussion of anti-Black racism and the rise of American medicine. To remind us of the seriousness of the problem facing Black Americans, Black mortality is the highest of any racial group in the United States. This mortality difference starts from birth. Singh and Yu point out, as we see from 2018 CDC data on the left, that there is a five-fold difference between infant mortality rates ranging from Chinese infants at 2.3 per 1,000 to Black infants at 11.2 per 1,000. And the inequities between white and Black Americans has actually grown, according to their analysis on the right. If we recall our axiom from Ibram Kendi, that racial inequities result often from the minds of white folks, an idea supported by Gunnar Myrdal's 1944 An American Dilemma, we won't be surprised to find hiding under the rock of pain treatment and these other inequities, the slugs of racist ideas and racist policies. Take the ideas, for example, that Black people compared to whites age more slowly, feel less pain, coagulate more quickly in their blood, are less intelligent, have worse hearing and thicker skin, have less efficient lungs, are more fertile, are better at detecting movement, and better at fighting off disease. In this study, half of a sample of medical students and residents believed at least one of these incorrect ideas about biological differences between Blacks and whites. And those with more false beliefs made less recommendations for pain control. White study participants in this study could perceive pain on Asian faces, but could not perceive uh, pain as well on Black faces as they could on white faces, even with objectively equal facial structure and expression intensity. So we see that we have racist ideas that have never left. We still have them today. Healthcare providers still think of and still treat Black patients differently than any other patient. A final example was clinical algorithms we use today, and which we must interrogate for their underlying assumptions and potential to mislead us toward worsening disparities when applied prospectively. So let's recall one basic fact. As a reminder, Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. Said differently, we could classify humanity into any number of races, from 5 to 500, because we exist along a genetic spectrum. But we would find that two individuals from Africa can be more genetically distinct than two individuals from any other part of the world. Say, Albanians versus Aboriginals. And this throws out a whole lot of our race-based clinical practice. So let's return to the original racist ideas that we've inherited. In an excellent talk, Harvard's Udodiri R. Okwandu explains that scientific racism is, quote, an attempt to co-opt the authority of science, unquote, to express racist ideas, while medical racism is a consequence of scientific racism. Central to both, she says, is a legitimization of race as a category. This started with taxonomy. Carolus Linnaeus, who created taxonomy in 1735, starting with kingdom, phylum, etc., is less known for also establishing four subspecies of Homo sapien. They were Homo sapien europaeus, which he said was ruled by intelligence, Americanus, ruled by superstition, Asiaticus, ruled by ritual, and Afar, for Africans, ruled by caprice, defined as a sudden and unaccountable change of mood or behavior. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach believed in five races. He came up with the term Caucasian, which we still use today, and thought the others were degenerative from it, but still capable of intellectual prowess. This belief was in stark contrast to Americans, starting with Thomas Jefferson, who believed Black people were inferior in both body and mind, with one possible exception. And it was he, Thomas Jefferson, who has been described as the first ideologic racist by some American historians. Parenthetically, Jefferson made an exception for Benjamin Banneker, who wrote to him. He was a mathematical genius who also created colonial America's best almanac, built its first wooden clock, and who redrew from memory the design for the entire city of Washington, D.C., after the chief designer, Pierre L'Enfant, ran off to France with the plans for the city. Samuel Morton penned the most influential book on scientific racism, staking America's claim for leadership in this field. Crania Americana is considered the single most influential book in the history of scientific racism. He created high-tech images of skulls, mostly of dead Seminoles, and decided that Black skulls were smallest, and white skulls the largest. He thought Black people were a missing link between humanity, Caucasians, and apes. Crania Americana also led to phrenology, or the study of character and intelligence based on the shape of the skull, which we can still read lives on in Sherlock Holmes stories. Samuel A. Cartwright of Louisiana was quick to follow. He earned fame as an expert in the biological distinctions of Black people. In 1848, he published, quote, the diseases and physical peculiarities of the Negro race. Cartwright believed and spread the belief that Blacks were both physiologically and pathophysiologically different than whites. He propagated the idea that Blacks had smaller cranial measurements, causing lower intelligence, less sensitivity to pain, and so on. He even described diseases he said were unique to Blacks, like dysesthesia ethiopica, the desire to destroy the property of owners, struma africana, a form of TB only applicable to Africans, cachexia africana for pica, due to nutritional deficiency. And I'll just insert here the quick lesson that these ideas have actually continued to live on. He also cautioned that the same medical treatment which would benefit or cure a white man would often injure or cure a Negro, and instead prescribed, quote, putting the patient to some hard kind of work in the open air and sunshine. The compulsory power of the white man, he continues, by making the slothful Negro take active exercise, puts into active play the lungs, through whose agency the vitalized blood is sent to the brain to give liberty to the mind, unquote. At this point, let me pause for a personal anecdote. A constant refrain I heard in interviewing for medical school, and especially for my residency in places like Rush and Cook County, was you should come here to train because we have great pathology. Or even training here is like living inside Harrison's internal medicine, you see everything. This was always disturbing for me, but because what people were talking about were sick bodies, and these bodies always looked more like mine than their own. I developed a sense that my peers ultimately, in the deeply personal sense of the word, did not truly care about my people. What I hope to convey over the following slides is my understanding of how my ancestors' bodies were exploited to establish America's world-class education. To proceed, Cartwright illustrates how physicians never had a deep therapeutic relationship with my ancestors. As Washington points out, their real patient was the slave owner. This started with the first examination of an enslaved person, which, if it was on a slave ship, could result in an ill person being thrown overboard to drown. Medical decisions were based on soundness for work, including physical attractiveness to be raped. There is no doubt physicians supported these sales of some of my ancestors. From the 1844 offering of 21 bucks and 2 winches to this wanted ad by a clinician who sought sick Negroes on whom he could experiment. Through treating and experimenting on my ancestors, American physicians became world leaders in medical racism, eventually tutoring even the Nazis. Washington writes, quote, involuntary medical experimentation was the scientific personification of enslavement, unquote. 50% of original articles in 1836's Southern Medical and Surgical Journal reported experiments on Blacks. As one author said, Blacks bear surgical operations much better than white people, and what would be the cause of insupportable pain for white men, a Negro would almost disregard. I have amputated the legs of many Negroes who have held the upper part of the limbs themselves. The individual you see has testified to these horrors. He was John Brown, a victim of experiments on heat stroke. After being made to sit in a covered pit with burning embers, with only his head exposed, Dr. Thomas Hamilton gave him various remedies to prevent heat stroke. Hamilton eventually gave up and sold fraudulent pills to the public made of flour. Brown also endured studies of the depth of his skin as Hamilton applied blisters every 2 weeks to his extremities. Finally, Brown escaped to England, wrote a book about his life, and in that book said Hamilton, quote, tried other experiments upon me, which I cannot dwell upon, unquote. So let's shift and talk about the role of hospitals. Hospitals in the 17th century were, according to Paul Starr, almshouses for dependent persons of all kinds, including orphans and the mentally ill. Not until later did they specialize in serving the infirm poor, and much later they expanded to sick people who weren't poor. As Starr writes, quote, few institutions have undergone as radical a metamorphosis as have hospitals in their modern history. And developing from places of dreaded impurity and exiled human wreckage into awesome citadels of science and bureaucratic order, they acquired a new moral identity as well as new purposes and patience of higher status, unquote. But despite its Pulitzer Prize and 500 pages, the words slave and slavery don't appear once in Starr's work, as if no connection exists between medicine and the people who comprised in Southern hospitals most of the patients, Black people. To understand that history, we must go back to Harriet Washington, who confirms that, quote, hospitals were about as popular as homeless shelters are today, unquote. She continues that hospitals were, quote, less an institution for healing than a physician-centered venue for learning, training, and experimental approaches, unquote. She even cites Thomas Jefferson as writing, quote, it is poverty alone which peoples hospitals. To be exposed as a corpse, to be lectured over by a clinical professor, to be crowded and handled by his students, etc., unquote. Unlike Starr, however, Washington points out how teaching hospitals advertise Black bodies, both while still alive and after death, as clinical material for potential students. Virginia sought to compete with Philadelphia in establishing a medical school, and they did so based on their greater number of Black people, which they considered more adequate to supply the medical purposes of a large medical class. The Medical College of Virginia boasted of the numbers of Negroes in our factories, unquote, unquote, in 1840. And in 1848, its faculty proposed a hospital just for Blacks to use for clinical instruction. All over the South, patients were literal guinea pigs in hospitals. In a medical article called Chloroform, its effect in a case of castration, the authors report how a young man was treated for a minor injury and then castrated. Other authors report unnecessary amputations, as we've heard about recently too. Careers were built this way. The Medical College of Virginia, excuse me for changing too soon. The Medical College of Virginia was established in 1838, right in the middle of the peak of slavery. Grave robbing was the standard way all medical schools obtained cadavers to teach anatomy. Although socially condemned, there was no rest for the dead. Poor whites were impacted, to be sure, especially out-of-towners in the South with no family to defend them. But there was no racial equality as to who suffered. By 1788, according to medical apartheid, an industry was established in both North and South such that, quote, few blacks were permitted to remain in the grave, unquote. Some of my ancestors were even pickled in whiskey and placed in barrels for long distance shipping. For blacks, grave robbing meant that even in death, they weren't safe. One of our elders was quoted as saying, as praying, please God, I hope when I die, it'll be in the summertime, because Philadelphia medical schools were exhuming 50 to 85 fresh bodies each month during the academic year. To blacks, hospitals wanted you not for your well-being, but for your remains. The need for bodies led to actual murder. Black oral histories relay that night doctors actually committed murder to acquire bodies. This was called burking after the Scottish doctor who murdered between 16 and 23 people and sold these bodies in 1827 to 1828 to an anatomy professor, leading to legislative change in the UK. But burking remained as unreported in the US as the rape of a Black woman. Black corpses were displayed with no sense of dignity to the person. Doctors posed next to the Black bodies similar to the ways race mobs posed near lynching victims. I have chosen not to show any of these pictures in this presentation, though. Skeletons would hang in classrooms and doctors' offices. From Michigan to Mississippi, Baltimore to Louisiana, the bodies of my ancestors were exploited for medical education, and no one thought anything of it. Medical students would even play with human remains. One student got into bed to find his friends had left a Black woman there as a prank, Harriet Washington relays. I also found this tweet from someone whose grandfather attended Johns Hopkins and who attested to seeing his grandfather posing with two partially dissected Black men, but the author seemed not to understand the problem of this common practice. I've learned that at my own medical school, the University of Michigan, there was a Dr. George Prey who recorded throwing a piece of human cadaver from a nigger to his future wife, sister-in-law, and her daughter in order to scare them. Year after year, decade after decade, this culture pervaded our medical schools during their formative period in America. Washington describes how even plantation slave narratives report of empathetic physicians, but she argues, and we can see the point, that the pattern we've discussed of exploiting Black bodies blunted physicians' capacity. Finally, objectification of Black people extended into the American psyche through entertainment. Since Tom Rice's Jim Crow character established blackface as America's first form of entertainment by 1832, Black bodies were used to entertain whites. The first US emissary to Japan even brought blackface there as entertainment 20 years later. So if you happen to watch The Greatest Showman, I didn't, and I won't now, you wouldn't have learned that P.T. Barnum became famous solely through exploiting an elderly Black woman whom he claimed was 161 years old and had raised President George Washington. In 1835, P.T. Barnum, at the age of 25, who at the time was just working in a store and bankrupt, bought Joyce Heth, bought her in New York City. Joyce Heth was 80 years old. She had triplegia. She was unable to move both her legs and one arm. She was cachectic, described as all skin and bones. She had onychogryposis, very long nails like talons, and very dark complexion, but she had her teeth. Barnum got her drunk, pulled out all her teeth to make her look older, and he used her, displayed her to catapult himself to fame. George Washington was born 103 years before, so P.T. Barnum claimed that she was 161 years old and had actually raised George Washington as his nurse. Although a ludicrous claim, some believed him and some did not. Either way, he provoked more media attention, which sold more tickets. To disbelievers, he promised her autopsy after her death. And did he deliver? When Heth died, P.T. Barnum sold 1,500 tickets for a public dissection of this elder, which proved he was wrong, but it cemented his fame. He later exploited many other BIPOC people as well. We'll take a break now.